For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world but lose his soul? Mark 8:36. Welcome to church today. As you know, first of all, let's do introductions. Let's welcome Craig back.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We said that today we were going to do the How Great Thou Art sessions, but we're not just going to talk about a record. We're going to talk about the whole background and what led Elvis at this juncture in his career. Now, that particular version was the Harmonising Four. Now, Elvis, I don't know if you guys know, he greatly admired Jimmy Jones, who was the lead bass singer for that group. And he tried desperately to get him to sing on his upcoming sacred new LP, as we know, that will be called How Great Thou Art. Now, we're going to go back one video previous where we finished at Spin Out. We finished in April. Elvis had finished the movie and he was kicking around in Los Angeles for a couple of weeks at Rocker Place. That's where he was based. He had been to various bookshops because he was increasing his spiritual studies at this point. He had bought 3 or 4 books. He had bought new instruments because, as you know, as I've mentioned in the Spin Out Spin Out video, he was constantly listening to Peter, Paul and Mary live in concert. He was listening to Odetta Sings Dylan, which would be a great influence on, you know, these sessions, because bearing in mind, these are not all secular songs. We've got some 5 new songs that came out or he recorded ready for new singles, because RCA at this point, they wanted 2 new singles, a Christmas single and a new gospel album. So where are we? So we're May 25th. We're at 1 o'clock in the morning. Elvis is boarded his Greyhound bus headed for Nashville RCA Studio B, apparently with 15 extra cushions. Now he says we don't go into detail on this channel. So anyway, I'm now going to hand over to Craig because he's been doing some great research on this. This has been a particular album favourite of ours for years, but we're going to give you a little brief history, or maybe in-depth history. I haven't seen his presentation yet, so we'll hand it over to Craig and I'll interject at different points, but we felt that we really needed to give this some absolute in-depth conversation because this is a pivotal point in his career where it could have gone one way or it could have gone another, but as you all learned, this set him on the right path once again. Yours.
Yeah, so the quote Scott made at the beginning, what shall profit a man? I think that's really key to where Elvis is, where he wants to go, and that he needs a change. We could say a change of habit, but that doesn't come till later, obviously. But at the point in his life, professionally he's at his lowest ebb. We know that. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to briefly go back and look at what the movies meant, why they made great business sense, which they did, but artistically they were castrating him. And we've got quotes from Elvis. We know around this time how unhappy he was. He was talking to anybody and everybody that would listen about how poor the movies were, how poor the soundtracks were, trying to get a decent song. So what we will do is we'll look briefly at why the movies made sense, but also we'll look at what it was doing to Elvis. So basically, what was the movie formula? Well, it was 3 movies a year. Elvis was being paid between $250,000 and $1 million a picture. Who's going to turn that sort of money down? When you look at where he's come from, his background, his payroll, that was a lot of money, even in those days. And today, that's a lot of money.
And they also earned profit on top of that as well, didn't they? 40 or sometimes 50% of the film's turnover would go directly to the Colonel and Elvis.
Okay, great point. Also, the budgets were really low to make the movies. So when you're looking at a low-budget movie, you're looking at a soundtrack that can be turned around within a couple of days.
It was more often than not 2 days.
Yeah, that's a lot of profit. So just for argument's sake, it costs $2 million to make a movie. You're looking at $4 million profit in just the States. And then you've got that movie going around the world in Europe. So they were big cash cows. And Elvis was making a huge amount of money. And we know...
And he was spending a lot as well, wasn't he?
I was just going to say, and he was spending a huge amount of money as well. So... And another example you could use was Tickle Me, where they used old material as well.
I mean, I have spoke about that before in the Tickle Me FTD. They used all old material. It all came down to cost. It's no secret. That's where we were at this point.
So we know through various research and reading particular books at this period that Elvis had found out that movies like Girls, Girls, Girls had actually been used as a vehicle or a cash cow, I'll use that word again, to be able to make more expensive movies. So Edward Holt, who wrote the screenplay with Alan Weiss for Girls, 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 he said, I'll only do this movie if I'm allowed to write the screenplay for Beckett. And obviously, the movie mogul, I can't remember his name.
Hal Wallis.
Hal Wallis, sorry, thank you, Scott. Hal Wallis said, yeah, no problem, I want you to do that. And that's what happened. Obviously, Elvis found out about this and he was deeply upset because he was thinking, well, why are my movies being made for better movies when I want my movies to be great?
Yeah, I think he knew the writing was on the wall then, didn't he?
Yeah. I mean, Alan Wise even went further. He basically said, he was asked in an interview, well, how do you write the songs for the movies? He said, well, we're told a title. To be honest, they could be numbers, because they'd still say they didn't even need a title. That wasn't actually his quote, but someone from MGM made that quote. And he said, all we've got to do is write 12 songs and then find dialogue to fit in between the 12 songs, which is crazy.
Criminal.
And you can imagine how this is making him feel. So we do have a little insight into how he's feeling, because in July of 72, he gave that interview for On Tour. And I've got his actual quote, which I'd like to use, because it's really pertinent to this video, though we're going ahead in a few years. So this is the quote he made On Tour. And this is verbatim what he said. It was work. It was a job. I had to be there at a certain time in the morning, worked a certain amount of hours. That's how I treated it. I was more concerned about if the picture was any good. If I was good, I cared so much until I became physically ill. I would become violently ill. I'd get a temperature or something would happen to me. The fact at a certain stage I had no say in it, sorry. I didn't have final approval of the script, which means I couldn't say this is not good for me. It was more or less that type of thing. I don't think anybody was consciously trying to harm me. Hollywood's image of me was wrong and I knew it. Couldn't do anything about it. I'd be right into production and I was doing a lot of pictures close together and the pictures got very similar. Lots of them very similar. And if something was successful, try and recreate it the next time around. So I read the first 4 or 5 pages and I knew it was just a different name with 12 new songs. Getting back to his quote again. The songs were mediocre. In most cases, I couldn't get good songs. So that's what might have made it seem like indifference. But I was never indifferent. I was so concerned. That's all I talked about. It made me sick. So I had to change it around. I was obligated 4 years in advance. So that gives us a great feeling of how he was feeling. So it's been 28 months since he's made a non-soundtrack album or any singles for that matter. Professionally, he's down in the dumps. As you rightly say, his spiritual teachings have taken on great new meaning.
He's looking for a new path, isn't he? And he's feeling that, he's reading these books, he's confiding in Larry Geller. He's looking at all these different avenues to try and give him hope or give him a direction that he needs to go in. And it would take a new executive at RCA, wouldn't it, to realise that Elvis was perhaps heading in the wrong direction, but maybe they could turn it around.
Yeah, so interesting you mention or allude to Harry Jenkins, because at the beginning of '66, RCA sent a telegram to Elvis saying, "Congratulations on 1965, your most successful year." 20 dignitaries had signed it, even the president of RCA. You had Steve Scholes had signed it also. But there was a little telling telegram, I guess, that Harry Jenkins would have sent the Colonel, or even by telephone, saying, "Look, your boy's doing great, but his albums are not selling as well as they used to.
No.
The movies are making a ton of money. Where I'm hearing grumblings that all is not well. Where is Elvis going?" And that kind of ignited something with the Colonel, because Harry Jenkins had been taken on to be head of merchandising for RCA. As we know, anything that was involved merchandising with RCA would also involve the Colonel. So basically, he was Colonel's right-hand man.
And we've mentioned Harry before because Joan Deary reported directly to Harry Jenkins. And she, as I mentioned in previous videos, she was quite instrumental in changing the massive amount of overdub work that happened to Elvis's later recordings in the 70s. But just to give you a bit of history, these were people that really cared about Elvis. They weren't just there to make the money. We've stated earlier, a lot of these contracts were signed mainly by the Colonel to feed both their habits, to feed both their spending habits. And, there would come a time where you need to change. And Elvis was feeling that. And this had been rumbling on probably from as early as 65, but 66 is the crux of it. And that's where we'd see a change.
And it's also important, that thing he says at the end, I was obligated 4 years in advance. So people often say, well, why didn't Elvis just walk away? He couldn't. He'd signed the contracts. The Colonel would have fed him some ball. Well, perhaps it wasn't ball, but he's saying, look, we've signed these contracts.
And they'll take the money to us for whatever they can.
I've done my deal, you stick to your deal. And that was basically how it was. And I think there was a lot of pressure on him, the Colonel. I think there was a lot of pressure on Elvis. Just going back to those spiritual yearnings that he had, and that's what I'd like to call them. Now, Elvis was mainly self-taught until really Larry Geller came onto the scene. He was reading all sorts of books. We know he loved The Prophet. We know he loved The Impersonal Life. But there was no one around him at that particular time, apart from Geller, who understood this yearning. So there was mocking behind closed doors. People were laughing at him. Oh, he's just on another kick. Why is Elvis always so serious? But this is where he was different from the others. He was different from them. His path was different. And we know he was a very deep, spiritual, intellectual man. And he was looking for answers of why it was him, why he was thrust into this position. So all these books, whether he was looking in the right direction or not, only he would know that, but they were giving him some answers that I believe he wanted.
He really believed that from an early point in his life, didn't he? And his mum told him, Gladys always told him, you're special. Yeah, we know he obviously lost his twin brother at birth, but his mum always said to him, you're special. And he believed that in himself. Do you remember that quote where he used to say, he used to sit on the sidewalk and watch all the fancy cars go by, and he knew one day that he would have something like that. And I believe that was instilled in him from such an early age, and he probably felt it within. So that's a really great point, and he was certainly different.
I think also Gladys said to him, you've got Jesse's heart beating inside of you, so that makes you twice as strong. And that stuck with him, and he believed that. And I firmly believe that he lived his life.
And people say that he spoke to his brother throughout his whole life, and he would speak to him in his mind. He would, and we know that, and that's been well documented.
Yeah.
Great point.
But also, I think he was part of this searching was that brother. So we're twins. We know what the link is. We know what the bond is. Now, I'm not likening us to Elvis and Jesse, but what I'm saying is there is a special bond between twins.
Yes.
And if that's missing in part of your life, that's a huge part that's missing of you. And I think that's just something to think about, because I think twins get that more perhaps than some other people. So, professionally, Elvis is in the wilderness. Personally, he's on this, I don't want to call it a spiritual kick, because that's what the guys would call it, because they never got it. But he's looking for something more. But what he does need, he needs something to happen. He needs his road back to Damascus. And that's what How Great Thou Art is. So, what I'd like to do now is if we could perhaps play the Statesman's How Great Thou Art.
Sure.
Because this is basically... this came out in *64, so Elvis was certainly aware of this recording.
Yeah, can we just touch on this point? Yeah. Ray Walker's made a point. I could read. In fact,
I've got it here, Scott.
Yeah, we could read it verbatim what he actually said. But basically, the crux of it, they were looking for an extra song for the How Great Thou Art album. Now, I don't really get this, because How Great Thou Art was recorded the very second song in the session. So he clearly knew he was going to record it. But Ray Walker turns it around and says that, and no disrespect to it, because we love Ray Walker, but I think he's got confused that they needed another song and they had to teach Elvis a song, but he had digested it in 3.5 hours.
Yeah, and when you look at, there's only 2 outtakes, there's 2 full takes and 2 full starts. So
he would have known that song.
Well, we know that the Blackwood Brothers did it in '57.
Yeah.
So the arrangement for theirs is slightly different. They use different words. We know the Statesman did it in '64 with Big Chief Wetherington, who took the lead. And that's where Elvis's deep register comes from, because I think that's the influence for him. The words are exactly the same, verses, etc. So what we'd like to do is just play a part of that, or play it all.
Yeah, but originally he did want to get Jimmy Jones, didn't he, and harmonising 4, and then they settled on the Imperials, didn't they?
Yeah. So he'd been obsessing about Jimmy Jones. When he come back to Memphis, he was going through his gospel albums. He was going through the Staples Sisters, the Blackwoods, the Statesmans, the Golden Gate Quartet. There was the Harmonising 4. These were all of his favourites. These were groups that he was brought up with. These were the songs that he sang around his own home with Gladys and Vernon.
He never forgot them, did he? And let's not forget where he was. These records would always be on, playing in his bedroom. Along with, obviously, we know he recently got into the folk, but the gospel never, ever left him. No. Never.
So what we're going to do is we're going to play a little bit of the Blackwood Brothers.
I see the stars, I hear the rolling thunder, I power throughout the universe display. When Christ shall come when shalt thou find the nation to take me home? When joy shall fill my heart, then I shall bow in humble adoration, and there proclaim, my God, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior, to thee. How great thou art. How great thou art. And sings my soul, my Savior, to thee. How great thou art. How great thou
Wow. Now, if you don't think that was Elvis's inspiration, there's something wrong with you. Bloody hell, that was brilliant. Now, as you can tell there, Chief Wetherington singing very much in his lower register, and that's exactly what Elvis did when he recorded his How Great Thou Art. Very much different from his Hand in Mine, where everything was light and his voice was like an angel, whereas in the How Great Thou Art, he's very much singing from his deeper register, and he's emulating the guys that he had listened to time and time again. This was Elvis's nod to them to say, I get it. I love what you do. Brilliant.
Really great point about the differences in voice. So we're what?
7 years later.
6 years later, aren't we? Yeah. And you're right. Elvis's voice in his Hand in Mine was so light and flighty. You said the other day, it's like he's singing over the notes. He's bouncing off them. On this, he's part of that music. So I think his voice is very somber. It has a whole lot of gravitas towards it. So when his version of How Great Thou Art starts, and you have all those voices, those 11 singers coming in, we've got the Imperials with Jake Hess. We've got Cheryl Nielsen, who's part of the Imperials. Yeah. We've got the 3 female singers. We've got the Jordanaires. When they go, when they started that, excuse my singing, but it's like God is coming.
I thought of a great quote yesterday. If you wanted to listen to God singing, listen to Elvis doing How Great Thou Art. It's just awesome.
And when his voice comes in, it's
and we will play it. Trust me, we will play it.
We will. But you're right. The Statesman Quartet, bearing in mind Jake Hess had left by this time to form the Imperials, that is his inspiration to me. I think Ray Walker is getting confused without him, because we know he didn't really know that him. So we know Jake Hess went to his car to get the songbook, and they did work on that for 3 odd hours. And there's quite a few takes of that song. I think it goes up to 14 or whatever. And he says in between recording that song, well, hang on guys, I don't know this, give me some light and all that sort of stuff. So he could see the words. So I think Ray's appraisal of it is coming from an honest place, but I think he's just confused without him and How Great Thou Art.
He knew that song.
Yeah, he got it down very quick. And also, bearing in mind when they'd been working on these songs in Rocker Place, Red Rest had just got those 2 professional tape machines. And they were working on an awful lot of songs. Charlie knew the version of The Sons of the Pioneers, and he played that for Elvis. And Elvis liked that version, which we've also got, but we won't play that. But he was also aware of the Statesman's one, and that was definitely the inspiration. So just going back to how important Red and Charlie were at this point. So they were basically screening all the songs that were coming in from RCA. This is where Hill and Range get involved because they only want songs that they have a cut in for Elvis to record. And that was part of the problem as well. So with the movie years, we've already spoke about, but it was also Hill and Range as well. So unless they had a cut in any particular song, Elvis wasn't recording it. So that was professional suicide for him. But some of the songs that they were doing, It's a Sin to Tell a Lie, Blowing in the Wind, obviously Dylan, 500 Miles, What Now My Love, Charles Bowyer.
Yeah, we love that record, didn't we?
We know how obsessed he got with that. In fact, what was the next movie after Spin Out?
Spin Out would be Double Trouble.
Double Trouble, and then it went to Clambake, didn't it?
Yeah.
So we know that he gave out Clambake, on the Clambake film set, he gave out all cast and crew a copy of that album because he was obsessed with it.
And just for those people that don't know that album, Charles Bowyer's basically talking through it, isn't he? There's no singing, and it's of a very particular taste. Either you'll get it or you won't. But it really resonated with Elvis. Yeah, he loved it.
I mean, Pepe Le Pew, the cartoon character, was based on this man. So if you can imagine that accent and how he was talking through these songs. But Elvis became obsessed with that album, and it continued throughout his life. And obviously we got some of Red's compositions as well. So Mary Lou Brown, Beyond the Reef was kind of like a three-part coalition, wasn't it? So these are all the things that are going on, also as well as the gospel, which some of the songs came from, didn't they? So Tomorrow's a Long Time, Dylan. We got Love Letters in there. We got Down in the Alley.
Fools Fall in Love, yeah.
We got some of that stuff. Right, so we've spoken about what was tasked of him. We know he hasn't been recording professionally. And I say that professionally because I find that when you listen to the difference in the voice from Spin Out to How Great Thou Art, we're talking about two different singers. So we're talking about a guy who's going through the motions of singing Spin Out. And I'm not degenerating his vocals on those because I'm not. He's doing the best with what he's got. But when he's got material that he really believes in...
Well, look, let's not kid ourselves. The three best songs on that album were the three bonus songs that were all recorded after How Great Thou Art. So Elvis has found his professional recording voice that he wants for his career. That when he first started out, think about when he started out in the 50s and he made all those professional recordings. Every one of them, he gives 100%. You hear it, there's nothing left. As he would say, you could stick a fork in it and it was done. There was nothing left undone in the 50s. We get to the early 60s, it would be the same. And then we're getting to this period from, I guess it would start as early as, I like 64 because we've got Roustabout. I think it's a great soundtrack. But you could go as early as 64. And of course we go 65, 66. But as I said in my last video in Spin Out, there would be a change because they released those three bonus songs that were done from June the 10th. And that really made that album better than what it ever should have been.
Okay. So let's just go back to the main players that were on that session. So we know that he couldn't get Jimmy Jones.
No.
But they did somewhat appease him with the Imperials and Jake Hess, he had gone away from the Statesmen and formed that new group. We know Sherrill Nielsen is part of that. Obviously, Sherrill Nielsen will play a huge part in Elvis's career later on the road and with his gospel stuff. And this wasn't the first time that Elvis had met Jake Hess. Now, this is a misconception that a lot of people believe that they'd met the first time on the How Great Thou Art session. This wasn't true. So when Jake was with the Statesmen, they used to, every 3 or 4 months or so, used to go down to Tupelo before they did the big singing at the Ellis Auditorium.
Great story, this, yeah.
And Jake Hess remembers this little boy. And I believe there was about 9 or 8 years between Jake Hess and Elvis. So this isn't baloney. This is a factual story that Hess has gone on record as saying that he remembers this little boy kept coming up to him and asking him questions. And some of the questions he would ask him were, how many suits do you have? How many recordings have you made? And it was only later when Jake Hess got to know Elvis properly and when Elvis was Elvis, that conversation had taken place. And it was only then that Jake Hess realised, hang on, that little kid was you.
And he corroborated the story, didn't he? He said, yeah, I asked those questions.
And that is, that's a peach of a story. So, as we know, we can't underestimate how much Elvis loved Jake.
And didn't I read, I think I read somewhere that on the How Great Thou Art sessions, Elvis wanted to give the lead to Jake, didn't he?
did. There's about 6 or so songs.
What a great
gracious
compliment
artist,
is that,
yeah.
exactly.
And of course, they did do a duet, If the Lord Wasn't Walking by My Side. And when Jake's singing that in the session, he's saying, Elvis, I'm not too loud. He goes, don't you dare back down. Don't you dare sing softer.
Brilliant.
And actually, when the recording came out, Jake said, yeah, you can really hear my voice. It's ridiculous. But they did turn me down a little bit. But Elvis really gave props to Jake Hess. I mean, Jake Hess, if not at that time, was the greatest gospel singer in the world. And interestingly, if you want to, there's a great quote I'm going to use later that Jake Hess makes about Elvis. But if you want to listen to the difference, and Jake Hess talks about the feeling that Elvis generates in a song.
That's what set him aside for everyone else, didn't it?
If you listen to Jake Hess's version of How Great Thou Art on the incomparable Jake Hess album in 1968, compare it to Elvis's, wow. I mean, Jake is, I can't express what a great singer he is, but the emotion and feeling that Elvis generates within that, I think that's what Jake's talking about. But go and have a listen to it. It's on YouTube. You can download it, but it's a real eye-opener. So another key part of this session, obviously we know we've got the Jordanaires as well, who are there with his hand in mind, so they're obviously familiar with how this works. The Imperials have been part of RCA for some time. They've been recording Christmas albums and religious albums. So Harry Jenkins, his secretary, recommended them for the sessions, and Elvis was really excited to be working with Jake.
And, of course, we've also got, for the very first time, it will be Felton Jarvis's first debut as Elvis's producer. Now, Chet Atkins had been producing a lot of Elvis's work up to this point when he was at RCA Studio B. Obviously, we know at Radio Recorders it was different, but Chet believed they had recently acquired Felton from Atlanta Records, and Chet felt that working all through the night, Felton would be the best guy, because Chet didn't like these all-night sessions. You know, they would start at 7 p.m. and they would, start at 10 p.m. and they go right round to 7 o'clock in the morning. And Chet, he liked his sleep, bless him. So that's when Felton first came on the scene. And Felton is very instrumental in pushing this session. You know, it was his first time. He was looking to impress as well. And this isn't the lazy Felton Jarvis that I think we got a little bit later in Elvis's career. This is the Felton that's really trying to goad Elvis and say, come on here, you've got another one in you. We can do this better.
Yeah, he's gently coaxing him on the way. But what's the first thing that Felton and Elvis spoke about? Well, it's Felton producing Fats Domino. As we know, Elvis and Fats Domino, huge friends, huge respecters of each other. And all Elvis wanted to know is, well, what was Fats like to produce? Also, he was talking about the British sound, that he wanted that energy and that vibrancy that all the British bands were bringing over. And he's saying, why aren't my music sounding like that? And basically Felton's agreeing with him. He said, well, the drum and bass, you really need it high on your recordings. That's some of your greatest recordings where you got all that energy.
Definitely.
So Felton recognised this. Felton was a huge Elvis fan. He'd impersonated Elvis early in his career. He produced a record as an ode to Elvis by another a singer, something to do with Vince Everett from Jailhouse Rock. But he was a massive Elvis fan, and they kind of mirrored each other. So it's interesting that when they first met, they both had that same energy. And Felton was a great mover. So in the studio, Felton would mimic Elvis's moves. So when Elvis was doing particular stuff, and Elvis used to look across and he used to love that. So it used to give him energy. But the crux of this session for me is the culmination of all those voices.
Absolutely.
We've got 11 voices, we've got Elvis's. And Jake Hess makes this great quote about the adrenaline of that sound got Elvis really pumped. And he loved that big sound. And he alludes to that in the 72 interview where he said the dynamics have got to be right. You've got to have a bigness of sound. And with those gospel songs and all those great voices, because he also recognised that in the gospel field, they were some of the greatest voices in the world. And he wanted that on his stage show that would come later, but he also wanted it on this record.
And when this album would be completed, Elvis was so proud of this album. Let's not get away from this. This was probably his proudest recordings for his whole career, without a doubt.
I agree with that. There's such a sustained effort in it. So some of the songs are not easy for him.
There's something stretching vocally,
he
isn't he?
What's the one he done with Priscilla? Sorry, with Lisa Marie.
When
just
No One
came out.
Stands Alone.
Yeah, so that's
struggling with
kind
that,
of out
isn't
of
he?
his register, but he really makes an effort on that, and he gets a great recording in the end. But it wouldn't be easy. Some of those songs weren't within his range, but he was going to work at them, and he pushed himself. And just going back to How Great Thou Art, though we always knew that he wanted to be part of a gospel quartet, he's literally singing all four parts in that How Great Thou Art. So that's a tip of his hat to those great gospel quartets, but that's also a tip of our hat to him, what a phenomenal singer he was at this particular time. And that, I have not heard a How Great Thou Art version that comes
anywhere near
close to Elvis.
No.
The Harmonising Four, I think, is very close, and the Statesman, which I love, but the feeling that Elvis generates within that, it is like God's coming over the hill, and it's just incredible. Anyway, Jerry Schilling was in the studio watching all this transpire. Now, bearing in mind How Great Thou Art is not even Jerry Schilling's favourite song, but he does talk about a moment that happened when Elvis hits that top F at the end. And I've got a quote which I'd like to use because it kind of brings together what we're saying. So this is Jerry Schilling. He turned white as a ghost at the end of the song, giving his all. He went down on one knee. I was sitting in eye contact when he looked up, and he just kind of smiled, and he knew I'd watched something great.
And that wouldn't be the first time that Jerry had snuck up on Elvis. Well, he obviously didn't sneak up in his session, but there's a great story in the Graceland book that came out, I don't know, must be 20 odd years ago now, isn't it? That he's talking, one day he's up, or he's out the back in Graceland somewhere, and he can hear some beautiful music coming from the music room. And he walks in, and he kind of just hides behind the corner. And he hears Elvis singing You'll Never Walk Alone. And he just said it was the most beautiful music he'd ever heard. And Elvis looks up and he smiles at him and dives back into the song. But that just reminded me of that great story. It's just fantastic.
Just going back to Jimmy Jones as well. So Elvis is tipping his hat to him a lot in these sessions as well. So a lot of the Harmonising Four songs appear on this album. So we got Farther Along, Somebody Bigger Than You and I, Where Could I Go But to the Lord. So, you know, these are major influences on him. And I do believe that this album was an ode to those great gospel groups, that part of the life he wanted to be part of, because there was no one bigger in his life than the gospel singers and the quartets. They were his heroes. I mean, you said that to me before. You know, Elvis is our hero. Well, who was his hero? Because he never had this Elvis Presley in his life, but those were the gospel quartets. J.D. Sumner, Jake Hess, all these guys that he idolised. And
in terms of, just to tell you how well the album eventually did do, it went gold within a year of being released. So in February of 1968, almost exactly a year after it was released, it went gold by the RIAA. Now, His Hand in Mine, which was released in 1960, that would go gold in 1969. So you can see how much of a great seller it was. Still didn't get to number one in the charts. I don't think any gospel album would have done in those days. But it got to number 18, so it did really well.
And I thought also part of that is the Colonel's thinking, well, hang on, how well will a gospel album do throughout the year? Well, we know Easter, we know Christmas,
Mother's Day as well, didn't they?
so,
They would always do stuff like
you
that.
know, he always had an eye on what was a great opportunity to sell an album. But his heart was very different to Elvis's. Elvis was making this record. One, it was the start of something. It got him out of making some of those lousy soundtracks, movie soundtracks, and it got him to recording what he wanted to record again. And I keep going back to him being this professional singer again. He was when he cared, when he was in control, when he was picking the material, he was making great music again. And that's key to what How Great Thou Art gave him. Now, this wouldn't fix everything immediately. We know he still had to go back and do these movies. Yeah. We know he still had to go back and do Clam Bake and stuff like that. But what it reaffirmed, and this is what we both believe within his own mind, is that when he was in control, when Hill and Range weren't controlling the music, Hollywood wasn't controlling his destiny, when he was in control, he was Elvis Presley, the great artist again. And it gave him that inner belief
Absolutely.
to be able to be who he was. And what greater way of portraying who he was than was through his gospel, because that was who he was. So I would like to, there's a couple of things that we just need to close up on. One would be the Jake Hess quote, which I really want to use. And the other one would be the email. I'm way ahead of my time. The telegram he sent Felton Jarvis after he went back in June.
And then I'll just, briefly we'll talk about, obviously for the record purists, there would only be a single release of this, which would be a promo copy that was sent out to DJs only. How Great Thou Art and His Hand in Mine would be sent to record DJs, and they would promote the album. And of course, How Great Thou Art and His Hand in Mine will come out again in April 1969, released as a single, but it didn't chart. How Great Thou Art and So High was the promo copy. Sorry, getting ahead of myself there. But bearing in mind, in 69, it didn't chart because obviously most people had probably bought that album by that point. And of course, we get on to the two singles, which would be Love Letters and Come What May, which was released in June 66. It would be known as a vacation special from Elvis, promoting Paradise Hawaiian Style, which I've spoke about in another video. And then from November 66, we get If Every Day Was Like Christmas and How Would You Like to Be. And then in the February of 67, which is 1 month before it was released in the USA, 2 months before it was released in the UK, we get Indescribably Blue and Fools Fall in Love. And on the bottom of that single, it says, coming soon, Elvis's new sacred LP album, How Great Thou Art. So it was one of these that was heavily promoted, and that speaks for itself in the sales that it generated.
Did you want to show them behind you what you've got here?
Yeah, I mean, most guys can see that, but what we've got here, we've got His Hand in Mine, the FTD release, How Great Thou Art, the FTD release. I've got a 1970s mono orange label, a 1964 USA press living stereo, the original 1960 UK, a Dutch album, Elvis Gospels, When No One Stands Alone, He Walks Beside Me, the Elvis FTD Touch Me, the original Elvis He Touch Me, You'll Never Walk Alone USA, the Speaker's Corner, His Hand in Mine. As you can tell, I love His Hand in Mine. His Hand in Mine, the RCA International. And then I've got a Speedway up there because it kind of falls in where we'll be going after this this particular album. And then
obviously we've got the FTD release. I can't recommend this enough. So if you want to see how the sessions transpire, there's a lot of talk on here. There's a lot of Felton Jarvis, as we spoke about, coaxing Elvis. There's a lot of Charlie keeping the mood light as well and trying to get Elvis to be really, up. And everyone is playing their part in this to make this album as great as it became. And they knew how important this was. Everyone played a part in this. And there weren't no B-listers on this. They were all A-listers. The best guys in their field. All the Nashville players. They were all the usual guys that he used.
18, yeah, they're always there.
They were the 18. David Briggs makes an appearance, doesn't he?
Letters.
With Love Letters, which I know Scott's touched on before. But these were top guys that made, I think, his greatest gospel album. Right, getting back to the Jake Hess quote. And for me, this really sums up who Elvis was as a singer. So, this is Jake Hess. Elvis was one of those individuals. When he sang a song, he just seemed to live every word of it. There's other people that have a voice that's maybe as great or greater than Presley's. I don't know. But he had that certain something that everyone searches for all during their lifetime. He sang a lot with his eyes closed. And I think the reason for that was because he wanted to paint a picture in his mind at all times. If something was distracting him to where he couldn't put his heart into that, what he was doing, he would close his eyes so he could get that picture of what he was talking about. That's the reason he communicated with the audience so well. And I think that epitomises Elvis the singer, where it is that feeling that he infuses.
It's all about feeling. And I've always said this in the past. The greatest singers the feel it gives them and the feel it gives you when you listen to it. And we know, you know, I spoke about when we spoke about I Lonesome Tonight, where they would turn the lights down in the studio, and they did this on the How Great Thou Art session throughout the whole sessions. And I think it's quite interesting that when the Imperials were there, he's really geared up for it, isn't he? You can tell. But at the end, because obviously, I don't know if we told you, but this took place on May 25th, 26th, 27th and 28th. And the last day, the Imperials had a prior engagement, so they weren't at that session.
Canada.
Yeah, and he's not as interested because they're not there.
They got 2 songs out of that session.
Yeah, and as you can see, they just them being there drove him on. These were, as Craig said earlier, these were this guy's heroes. These are who he looked up to. And he was always the gentleman around them. You can imagine how he would have been in the studio with them. It would have been yes sir, no sir, and that's who he was. And we got one last quote before. Look, we're going to wrap up soon. We're going to close it obviously with How Great Thou Art. Craig's got one more quote. You know, obviously we'll end on Craig's quote, and then we'll end with How Great Thou Art. I'd like to thank you all for watching. Brilliant work, Craig. You know, as I said, this would go in at some depth. I'm sorry if it's been too long for some people, but we both recognise that this isn't a subject that you can just skim over. This isn't going to be a 15-minute video. This is going to be the nuts and bolts of what made How Great Thou Art so great, and where I've been leading up to over the last 2 or 3 weeks. I always knew I was going to get Craig in on this because his knowledge is absolutely first rate, and I really appreciate it, Craig. I think you've done fantastically well. But we'll close with this quote, and then we'll close with the man doing what he did best.
So, this is Dear Felton. This is July 16th, 1966. Please convey how much I deeply appreciate the cooperation and consideration shown to me and my associates during my last 2 trips to Nashville. I would like to thank you, the engineers, musicians, singers, and everyone connected with the sessions. Please see that every one of them know my feelings, and as General MacArthur once said, I shall return. And Scott shall return also next week.
Yeah, brilliant. Hit it.
Consider all
Elvis down on one knee, looking up. And that's just what Jake Hess was talking about. You heard it there. TCB.